Okay. Good morning, faculty, students of the university, and our honored guest. My name is Audra Savakul, and I'm thrilled to be the announcer of this year's third annual Dawson Society Lecture. Dr. Kitzinger is a faculty member and dean at the Thomas More College of Liberal Arts in Merrimack, New Hampshire. He holds a PhD in modern intellectual history from St. Andrews University in Scotland, as well as degrees in politics from David Lipscomb University and Pepperdine. Dr. Kitzinger teaches a variety of courses across multiple disciplines, mainly in the humanities, emphasis on Greek, medieval, and modern, and moral philosophy, ethics, economics, and politics. Among his scholarly interests are Aristotelian, Thomistic, moral and political philosophy, Christian personalism, and the intellectual and political history of German Catholicism. In his spare time, Dr. Kitzinger enjoys time with his family, working on house projects with his boys, and following European football. Besides Germany and Scotland, Dr. Kitzinger has lived in all four corners of the United States, from Tennessee to California, from Michigan to West Virginia, and now in New Hampshire. Dr. Kitzinger resides in Nashua, New Hampshire, with his wife, Dr. Sarah Kitzinger, and their three sons, Joseph, Philip, and Nicholas. The title of this talk is The Mark of Our Age is Anti-Personalism, Dietrich von Hildebrand's Fight Against Nazi Totalitarianism. Please help me welcome him to the podium.
So I have to understand how close I have to be to the microphone for you all to hear me. So is this okay? Yeah? Okay, great. Well, thank you, Audra, for this introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I come from Thomas More College, an institution very much different than the one you enjoy here. We have just about 100 students, we have one major, and a very, very small faculty. And when she listed my scholarly interests, the one that I spent least time on these past years is the one I'm going to speak on today, so I'm sorry. That's what's going to happen. But anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's maybe known to some of you that I have a long friendship with Dr. Stewart, and we haven't been able to see each other and revive that friendship and live out that friendship for some time, so I'm pleased on two accounts. Thank you. Okay. I don't know if we have any priests here, but if we do, I can't tell. Reverend Fathers, esteemed faculty, staff, students, friends, and guests of the University of Mary. The title of my talk is, as was mentioned, The Signature or Mark of the Age is Anti-Personalism, Dietrich von Hildebrand's Fight Against Nazi Totalitarianism. So let me begin. One day, after the signing of the infamous Reichskonkordat between the Vatican and Germany, the Catholic intellectual elite of Germany's Catholic Academic Association gathered in their third sociological conference at the Benedictine Abbey of Maria Laach from the 21st to the 23rd of July 1933. At the opening of the conference, Abbot Ildefonс Herwegen made two analogies that led him to praise and approve of the new regime and the total state. In the presence of a great number of brown shirts, Herwegen first asserted that the aims and ideas of the liturgical movement, with its center at Maria Laach, corresponded to fascism. Fascism, he said, is in politics what the liturgical movement is in religion. In his second analogy, Herwegen likened the nature of the new sociological entity, the total state, to the church, organically understood as the Corpus Christi Mysticum. In other words, the total state corresponded analogically to the organic order of the church and this Pauline ecclesiology. As fascism united individuals into one national organic community under a strong authoritarian government and leader, so did the liturgy unite Christian believers into one ecclesia, one body, under its head, Jesus Christ. Herr projected Pauline Corpus Christi ecclesiology onto the state, or polis. Ecclesiology informed politics. Like the church, the state imitated the single organic relation between head and body, the leader and its people. The Catholic personalist philosopher and convert Dietrich von Hildebrand converted in 1914, was not present when with these words Herr opened the conference. He had fled with his family to his Italian residence in Florence. With his departure, a long debate in the Academics Association between him and conservative Catholics, we'll meet some of them, had come to a close. Hildebrand had been the principal opposition to this right Catholic movement, even the only one who raised his critical voice. But as Herwegen's remarks show, his labor was not crowned with success. To the contrary, he was forced to give up his beautiful home in Munich and his career at the university there. He left on the 12th of March, 1933, just days before the Nazi seizure of power. In my talk today, I would like to explore how it had come to this fateful Third Sociological Conference in 1933 and examine von Hildebrand's critical voice in the preceding discourse, a voice, again, that failed to persuade his opponents. The central concern of all parties in this discourse was how to overcome the liberal economic and political order and avoid, at the same time, both individualism and collectivism. The disagreement between the parties was over the underlying principles. What is the proper relation between person and community? That is, between the members of the community, the parts, and the whole, the community. This mattered because it turned on the pressing question of what right or how much authority the political community, the state, here taken as the whole, ought to have over the individual, the members or the parts. Vice versa, it mattered because it addressed the question what freedoms the individual, the member or part, rightly enjoyed beyond the duties owed to the whole, to the political community or the state. Hildebrand championed the primacy of the person over the community. His interlocutors, the primacy of the community over its members. Now, the talk follows the development of the discourse in roughly 4 steps. After we set out the context until 1930, we'll turn to the earlier conferences prior to 1933. There were 2, 1931, 1932. And then in the final step, we'll return to the conference and Herwegen's fateful remarks that we introduced at the beginning of the talk. So a little bit about Dietrich von Hildebrand. Von Hildebrand was born in 1889, the same year as Christopher Dawson, Martin Heidegger, Adolf Hitler. He was an emigre to the United States, and there he taught philosophy at Fordham and became an outspoken commentator on the post-Vatican II Church and period. As mentioned, he had converted to Catholicism in 1914, just before the beginning of World War I. With his conversion, a new world opened before him, what he called the new world of Christianity. Hildebrand, one can ascertain from records about his childhood, early education, always loved truth. Now he loved the truth. Conversion changed the orientation of his philosophy, but not its character. Hildebrand, the now Catholic philosopher, thought of his function and work as philosopher as the preparer of the way to Christ. Now, this is also the key to understanding his work in and for the German Catholic Academics Association. The association was arguably the most important Catholic intellectual organization during the Weimar period. It gathered many of the prominent German and Austrian Catholic intellectuals and was an association of intellectuals for intellectuals. and Hildebrand identified with the mission of that association and quickly rose in its ranks. Until 1930, the principal interpretative pattern of the association's discourse on the nature and forms of community had been in line with Hildebrand's own personalist mind. It posited that, quote, the uniqueness of the person was above and beyond the community, end quote. For most of the 1920s, what we may call a personalist sociology had maintained a delicate balance between accounts of organic community, the claims of the whole of the community, and the spiritual person or the part. With time, this balance came under pressure. The 1929 stock market crash, and the inability of Weimar's parliamentary process to manage the ensuing economic and social crisis further depleted the already precarious and volatile support for the democracy. The Republic's political culture shifted to the right, and the call for authoritarian leadership echoed across the ideological and political spectrum. In his 1930 work, Metaphysics of Community, published by the association, Hildebrand described the situation. He wrote of a, quote, enormous number of false conceptions of community and communitarian trends. The person was now threatened to drown in visions of comprehensive communities. Such visions were inspired by a desire to finally overcome the supposed egoism of modern liberal society. Hildebrand offered a contrast to elucidate the contemporary situation. Earlier times, he said, failed to recognize the intrinsic value of community and only acknowledged value in the community insofar as it served the individual. Now, however, Hildebrand warned, we are faced with an excessive overestimation of the intrinsic value of community. This, he thought, led to a perhaps unprecedented danger. The eternal value of the individual human person was now threatened to be obscured. The communitarian quality of the age, Hildebrand described, was manifested in the excessive identification with nation, or Volksgemeinschaft, and state. Many contemporaries lamented the disintegration of community life by the selfish, above all, economic actions of individuals. Both the nation and the people's community promised to many Germans belonging and identity. So this political and socioeconomic crisis of the late 20s also affected Catholics, and voices in the Catholic Academics Association renewed their hope to overcome liberal modernity. Franz Xaver Landmesser, new head of the Academics Association, noted that more and more organic principles inform ideas of social order and the world of work. Appreciation for the mysteriousness of organic and vitalist ideas broke out of hidden depths, theologian Arnold Rademacher wrote. The contrast between society and community was invoked. Community, it was said, was not made. It is and takes persons into its care. Community has meaning. Society, on the other hand, a function and purpose. Meaning resides in the group, which calls itself community, immanently. The function or purpose lies outside of the association or group. Community is aristocratically constituted, society democratically constituted. Community is a living thing, a whole. Society is a rationalistic thing, a sum. After these words, Rademacher made the decisive claim. The persons or members of the community were the Glieder or limbs, one could also translate it as parts, of an organismal social whole. He continued, community is something like an organism. One could say a moral organism. An organism, by contrast to anything inorganic and artificial, which is made up of mechanical parts, consists of biological units, of cells. The cell serves the whole, and the whole serves the cell. The parts of a community are not mere pieces, but limbs. The persons which compose the community live by the whole and for the whole, and the whole lives by the persons and for the persons. So what we should note there is that the discourse moves ever more towards an emphasis on the organic nature of community. And I'll turn now to the first sociological conference, which took place in 1931. In 1931, the discourse in the Academics Association took a turn towards authoritarianism and communitarianism, or, in other words, the primacy of the community over the individual person. Franz Xaver Landmesser had invited the Austrian philosopher and sociologist Ottmar Spann to the association's first sociological conference at Maria Laach. To Hildebrand, Spann's inclusion in the association's search for social ethics indicated the most radical preference for community, particularly for state and nation. Spann's invitation was a clear signal that the otherwise sociological philosophical conversation about person and community now turned into a conversation about the national community and models of a total state. Landmesser hinted at this shift. A sociology of the state was a lacuna. Thus far, the association's work had only focused on the elaboration of a sociology of the economy. That was the principal focus of one of the association's committees. And indeed, Spann was the key promoter of a neo-romantic authoritarian political and social theory in the 1920s. So you have to imagine, if you're Hildebrand, you're thinking you have a balance, you recognize some tendencies towards a kind of romantic, organic interpretation of the community. And then the head of your association invites Ottmar Spann, who's an outspoken proponent of community understood in an organical or agonismal way. So Spann's ideas played a critical role in Catholics' reconciliation, even agreement with National Socialist ideas. Now, what we have to add to our history, our story here, is that earlier in 1931, prior to this conference, Pius XI's encyclical Quadragesimo Anno had set a critical stimulus for Catholic social thought. In his introduction to the 1931 conference, Landmesser extracted from Quadragesimo Anno 2 points that were to streamline the deliberations at the conference. Firstly, Catholic social thought had to be articulated in conscious opposition to collectivism. And secondly, Catholic social thought had to be built upon the cooperative idea, on the basis of which a Catholic social idealism was to be constructed, he said. So the Pontiff's encyclical sparked an intense debate over the realization and interpretation of a cooperative order. This task was the principal reason for Spann's invitation. The conference was introduced by Landmesser. Herwegen, the abbot of the Benedictine Abbey, led the discussions. What did Spann share with his colleagues and interlocutors? In his 3 talks, Spann called for a spiritual re-education that would lead the way to the right comprehensive view of social reality, to the great counter-theory and social idea which prepares the victory of a new spirit over a moribund present. Spann called his key idea universalism, or thinking from and through the whole. Universalism meant any conception of society which comprehended in the spiritual relationship between individuals a creative principle and assigned this connection, a connection that is beyond the individuals and a self-sufficient whole, a logical priority over its parts. So Spann is laying out an account of why the community ought to have a primacy over the individual. And he's saying that because when 2 or more human beings join together in community, what's created is something beyond the 2 parts that initiated that community. And that has a logical priority then to the parts, insofar as one could say, and this goes back to an Aristotelian idea, that the whole as a whole is prior to the parts. And we'll get more into that as we move along. Since the person was realized, or came to be fully realized only after and in membership in a community, the good of the whole, understood as a new being, apart from the sum of its members, must be given priority over individuals' goods or interests. Again, this is Spahn. Only community was a reality in itself, the proper reality, Spahn taught. In other words, the individual only was when part of a community, a family, a group, corporation, state, or church. In his other work, The True State, Spahn was even more explicit when he wrote that the individual was merely potency, merely something potentially existing, which required the community for its actualization and through self-employment and participation, through growing into its being part of a whole. We could say into its being by part of a whole. Since community was reality, the part could only gain reality, being as part of that reality. Personal being was a result of participation in the whole. Clearly, this meant the subordination of the individual to the community. Now, Landmesser praised Spahn's ideas and in 1931 embraced this universalism. He now argued that the whole was, quote, something self-sufficient, and echoed Spahn logically prior to the limbs. Moreover, in relation to the whole, the parts are not substantial self-sufficient entities. It's this that Hildebrand will attack. The parts are not substantial self-sufficient entities, but merely capacities, which had to be developed by the vitality of the community. Landmesser was convinced that if measured, Spahn's ideas offered principles and insights for the further development of Pius's teachings that could stimulate a rich tradition of Catholic social thought fit to address the ills of the age. However, many attendees of the conference listened to Spahn were critical. To categorically rank community above the person as he had just done, to conceive of it as prior to the individual, in particular the nation and the state, did not enjoy universal support, and least of all Hildebrand's. In their criticism of Spahn's lecture on universalism, participants essentially echoed Hildebrandian arguments, the error of understanding the person and the error in considering community as a substance. But since Spahn did not understand the priority of community over individual ontologically, but logically, he seemed to avoid Hildebrand's ontological rebuttal altogether. So Hildebrand was saying, communities aren't substances. They don't exist on their own. They're not things that are themselves bearers of other things that exist only on account of them, but rather are themselves dependent on beings that have full subsistence or existence, namely the person. Therefore, the person ontologically in his being is prior to the parts, has an ontological superiority. To Hildebrand, then, Spahn made an ontological argument. Spahn's rebuttal was to say, no, I'm not making an ontological argument, I'm making a logical argument. Hildebrand considered that only the Corpus Christi Mysticum as supernatural community was a substance, while natural communities were quasi-substances. So then he pushes, so Hildebrand is saying, I concede that there are such things as community substances, but that's only the case in one case, namely the church. Everything else only has a quasi makeup of substance. In the end, the 1931 conference closed with significant differences between the participants over the relationship between individual person and community. Neither side was persuaded by the distinction between ontological versus logical priority. So it's at this point that we move to the second conference in 1932. The fundamental disagreement regarding the relation between person and community and regarding the right interpretation of the corporative idea also occupied the second conference. But this had not been the intention. Hildebrand disrupted the proceedings and turned the Second Sociological Conference into a sequel to last year's. He criticized Father Thaddeus Soiron of collectivism for his reductionist conception of the human person and his failure to preserve the merely analogical meaning of the organic idea. What had Soiron argued? I'll provide you with a quote. Pauline theology, he said, offers the definitive solution to the social problem. So we see again, seeing the social problem, seeing the question of person and community through Pauline ecclesiology. There's no question that the great apostle to the Gentiles, Soiron wrote, wanted to solve the social problem by the organic conception of society. Not merely when we consider his solution to the problem of Christian society, but also when we consider the natural premises of his theological thought. Already in the natural social order must the human being understand her function as a limb or part, as the meaning of her social life. The life's work of the individual promotes the life's work of the whole, and the life's work of the whole promotes the life's work of the individual. That is the great social vision of St. Paul. So on. Now, Hildebrand also held the premise of the liturgical movement and postulated the church as mystical body of Christ, as the arch community. But he vehemently rejected the idea that the church be the model for natural communities, as Soiron had just done in the preceding lecture and comments, and as Herwegen would do at the next sociological conference that we had introduced earlier. Hildebrand replied to Soiron with an in-depth analysis of the relation between community and personality or person. Not the idea of totality and organic community drawn from the analogy to the church as mystical body was supposed to be the principle through which to understand community and person, society and state, but rather the ontological primacy of the person must serve as the association's interpretative pattern or principle. At this point, Hildebrand openly likened his colleagues to collectivists and accused them of collectivist thinking, and asserted again that the person was its own totality, a complete whole already and prior to membership in a community. So Spahn says the human being, the person, is not fully himself or a human being outside of any community inclusion and integration. Hildebrand is saying, no, the human being is already a complete whole before any membership in a community. Now, Hildebrand thought that his personalism cut right through the division between collectivism and individualism, a quasi-third way. The individual person, Hildebrand thought further, had an all-encompassing end or goal. And this end was the unum necessarium, the one thing necessary, what he conceived of as the imitation of Christ. In other words, salvation was the goal of the person as person. Consequently, Hildebrand argued, in those instances in which the community's meaning and end coincided with the end of the person, the ultimate end of the person, salvation, the danger of abuse or instrumentalization of the person did not arise. Such was the case for the church, but only for the church. He said, quote, "The church never looks at the individual person as means to an end. Her intrinsic goal is the sanctification of every individual, the glorification of God, which resides in each person's imitation of Christ. In this holy community are intrinsic goal of the community and final end of the person identical. In the Christian idea of community of the Corpus Christi Mysticum, there is no conflict between community and individual," he said. Again, by contrast, the great danger to the person and the potential for abuse of the person arose in those instances in which merely natural communities considered the person as a limb or of that totality. He says, quote, "There's a great danger to instrumentalize the person in those communities where ends and meaning of community and person are not identical, as in state, nation, etc., in which ends and meaning only compose a small aspect of the person. As soon as the function of a person as a limb of the community is deemed more important than the whole being of the person, such danger is unavoidable. Yet again, Hildebrand did not see the danger in organic social thought as such, but in its reductionist image of the person. It is indeed great progress, he conceded, when one acknowledges that the individual person is not a piece of the community, but a limb, and that community is not the sum of the individuals, but an organic whole. Yet to argue that the individual person is fulfilled in her function as a limb, that is, not to understand that the individual person is infinitely more than a mere limb of a natural community. That's to say that the person, as a person, is then complete and fulfilled when performing his or her function as a limb. That is the great problem and error. He says that this being a limb only amounts to a small dimension of a person's being must be understood. Not to understand that is a most fatal error. Now, at first, Hildebrand's labor seemed to have some effect. Landmesser, defending Spann's universalism, was now willing to critique the nationalist reduction of Spann's universalism. The rightly conceived universalism, so Landmesser, demands an economic supernatural extension. So we see some movement on the other side of this discourse. Landmesser now was willing to add to Spann's principles a Hildebrandian principle. He wrote, "As important as the principle that the whole cannot be reduced to its limbs might be, its inverse is as important. The limbs do not flourish totally and only in the whole." This is Hildebrand's thought. Here, it may be permitted to complement, this is still Landmesser speaking, Spann's ideas. And he recognizes Hildebrand. Doing so, we must refer to Hildebrand's thought from the Laach Conference in 1932. He's writing a report at this point. And Hildebrand hoped to safeguard the value and being of the individual person in the discussion about totality and personality. Thus, we could say Landmesser tried to reconcile Spann's and Hildebrand's positions. Yet in the final analysis, Hildebrand failed to persuade Landmesser, Herwegen, and others. What did he fail to persuade them of? Of the irreconcilability between person and community, or rather between his personalism and Spann's universalism. For Landmesser still judged that Hildebrand represented the, in his mind, incorrect opinion that in Spann's universalism the value of the person could not fully be respected, and that Spann's universalism entailed collectivist ideas, an accusation Hildebrand repeated in his memoirs. Landmesser and Seuron, he wrote in his memoirs, were infected by the collectivist poison of the time. Landmesser insisted that the philosophical aspects of universalism complemented Catholic social thought insofar as it was grounded in Catholic dogma, and he points here to the Corpus Christi Mysticum ecclesiology. Therefore, Landmesser stressed the right understanding of universalism, Spann's ideas, could pioneer today's Catholic social thought. Universalism, he declared, when rightly understood, is not disguised collectivism. In conclusion, then, the third sociological conference at Maria-Laach, the one we began with, took place only months after the Nazi seizure of power, and only weeks after all parties, with the exception of the NSDAP, the National Socialist Party, had been made illegal. As noted above, Hildebrand had already fled for fear of Nazi persecution. Landmesser, on the other hand, called on Catholics to, quote, cooperate with the Nazis and conquer the new political space. Why should Catholics do so? Although the National Socialist movement was not Catholic, Catholics' cooperation in the new political reality was justified because of Nazism's and Catholicism's broad intellectual consensus regarding liberalism and Marxism, cultural Bolshevism, the corporative order, and the organic conception of state. Specifically, and again on the basis of the Corpus Christi ecclesiology, Corpus Christi Mysticum ecclesiology, Landmesser argued that Catholic intellectuals ought to advocate a corporative universalism, the primacy of the whole before the part, as the principle of the construction of the new state and society. Landmesser advocated Catholic cooperation after Herwegen, in his opening remarks, had called for Catholic approval of the new sociological form of the total state. In this total state, the good of the whole reigns supreme, and those who do not follow were, quote, vermin to the community. Hildebrand's argument for personal dignity and personal ontological superiority did not convince Landmesser or Herwegen. Hildebrand's philosophy championed the ontological superiority of the person. I'm trying to wrap up a little bit here. While communities existed by nature and shared features of organic wholes, Hildebrand thought, the individual person's propensity to be a member of a community did not outweigh the person's dignity as substance and world unto itself above the community. By placing the person at the center of his social thought, Hildebrand hoped to avoid the false alternative between individualism and collectivism. He consciously took a third-way position and designed a position designed to avoid the Scylla of individualism and the Charybdis of collectivism. The ideas of Spann, however, were, quote, the Charybdis into which one steers upon avoidance of the Scylla of individualism. In this collectivist anti-personalism, Hildebrand saw the great terrifying danger of our times and the fundamental threat to social life and social justice. In other words, in collectivist anti-personalism, Hildebrand saw the path to totalitarian politics. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so now we'd like to open it up for some questions. So Dr. Stewart and then Mr. Stork over here are going to be going around the mic with some microphones. If you just want to raise your hand, they'll make sure that you get a microphone.
Can we recap really quick how Hildebrand saw individualism as evil as collectivism?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, that's a good question. So in one case, in the case of individualism, what he would say is that what dominates in individualism is self-interest as the principle of community life. So I enter a community on account of something that the community offers me or serves me. Yeah. And that he would then, in a personalistic fashion, further develop and say that kind of dispositional mentality, yeah, bars the person from opening up to what he would consider values and common goods, yeah, goods of others, etc. And that's a principal problem with individualism. So he would think that that's the principle behind the liberal economic, but also political order. So in a way, what he has in mind is the social contract theorists, in a sense, yeah. In a certain sense understood. With collectivism, there you reduce the person to a mere part, yeah, and leave out of consideration entirely the natural and good claims that the individual person has for what Hildebrand would consider a personal development, personal flourishing, and you be completely and absolutely instrumentalized into the end of the totality of the whole. Does that help? Great.
Hi, thank you. I thinking of another group of thinkers, and I don't think they're incompatible. Stanley Hauerwas, Alistair McIntyre, Virtue Christians in the late 20th century. I don't think they're incompatible, but I think they would. You said for von Hildebrand that you don't find your fulfillment in community, and I think McIntyre and Hauerwas would say you do, but I think the key is, what do you mean by fulfillment? So if they are compatible, could you distinguish the two for me? Does my question make sense?
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, question makes perfect sense, and I appreciate your pointing to something that would be a follow-up work that we all should do, which is to ask some more philosophical questions. What do we mean when we say fulfillment? What do we actually mean when we say part? What do we actually mean when we say whole? And do we agree with either one of these positions that I've presented in a historical discourse? So I appreciate the question. So when we think about fulfillment along Hildebrandian lines, it's rather curious, because Hildebrand seems to be thinking that in order for a community to fulfill the person, the community in a way has to follow the identity of the person. And what I mean by that is, it's only when you have the community of the church that you have a perfect image of the person ontologically and to an extent also teleologically present. Does it make sense? Yeah. And so what Hildebrand leaves out is, so therefore he will argue that other natural communities don't have that correspondence to the totality of the being that is the person, and almost immediately assumes that therefore the person will be instrumentalized to the lower goods and ends of the natural community. So there's immediately a means-ends thinking. Now, it's been a while since I read After Virtue, but the idea that human beings find fulfillment in communities, would have to, of course, also be measured against the common good of those communities and how much the common good corresponds then to the good of the person, understood as a social being. Yeah. And so there, I think what Hildebrand would not see, and what I think McIntyre and others would recognize, is, and what other thinkers like, say, de Koning have also recognized, is that there is an intrinsic superiority in the common good as a common good for the person that derives from the person's character as a rational being. And that the rational being can see the superiority of the common good on account of rationality allowing us to have universal knowledge and understanding of things, that the superiority of community's goods are superior to my private or personal or individual good, precisely on account of its extension to many more than myself. So there is a kind of a different ontology of the person at work, yeah, and therefore I think I would really like to do the work to figure out where the convergence is and where the disagreement is. And I see a little bit more of a disagreement than a convergence there.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Hi, thank you. Yes, great presentation. That was really helpful. I have two questions. And it piggybacks nicely off of the prior question. The first has to do with the analogy that was clearly recognized at the beginning between the way the Catholic Church, the supernatural community, and the natural community. What did Hildebrand recognize as the limit of that analogy? So I'm curious historically what Hildebrand thought about how applicable that was. And as a potential point of contrast, I've done some work on Carl Schmitt, who I'm sure you're aware of, who makes in an earlier, in the 20s, early teens, an argument for a direct, straight up secularizing riff off of Catholic ecclesial hierarchy, applying it directly to the political order. Yeah. I'm wondering, would that have made Hildebrand nervous? And then my second question, and because maybe you can attack it as a cluster, has to do with kind of the postmodern insight that there's a horseshoe effect to where the radical left and the radical right actually mirror each other. So if depersonalism is the hallmark of a radical collectivism, I'm wondering if it's the case that actually a radical personalism commits the same error, but on the other side of the coin, such that, and maybe you would just collapse that into individualism as like the individualist error. But I'm wondering if you can say something about the situation on the other side of the coin, that he wasn't able to win over the collectivist bunch, but it seems like one of the struggles is also a radical personalism that would annihilate the need for community, and that's how it relates to sort of Matt's question and the Hauerwasian critique.
Yeah, thank you again. Great question. I'll try to balance all of those good points. Yeah, I think the overarching question is, in fact, how to grasp the legitimate claims of the person against the community. And Hildebrand did in fact respond to Carl Schmitt's The Idea of the Political, I think, in 1927, 1928, he wrote a small article zur Begrenzung des Staates, about the limitation of the state. Right, so to that point. So yeah, it is absolutely curious and important to wonder just how would one determine what legitimate, let's say, freedoms of the individual person are, and what are legitimate claims of the community, obligations that we have as members to the community, to the social whole. And this might be helpful. What strikes me as important, and there are others that just recently have started working on this a little bit, is that you cannot really answer that question unless you think practically about communities and human beings. By that I mean that you posit first and foremost that what we are is important, but what we do determines to a large part these questions of freedom and obligation. So for instance, you say, with Hildebrand, it's very proper and good to say that we are substances and communities are not substances. Sorry, yeah, that makes sense to me. But if you then leave it at that level, you miss that communities are for the sake of goods. Yeah? And so human beings act for the sake of goods, so this Aristotelian Thomistic dimension. And when you do that, I cannot, if you avoid that or ignore that, I can't conceive of a way to appropriately answer the question, what is legitimate and what is illegitimate. I also think that if you avoid that conversation, you will not properly grasp the hierarchy of communities and the corresponding goods. Now, I'm not saying that that there may not be something that I don't grasp or see, but it's hard for me to grasp it. So I'm kind of responding, but not directly, perhaps. But maybe there's some follow-up.
Just the No, that's really helpful, and that's kind of where I'm stuck as well,
Yeah.
thinking about that myself.
Yeah, that's it.
But to the earlier question about the transposition of theological governance and order, transposing it directly to the political, I assume von Hildebrand that would make him nervous.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and then how did he think about that relationship
Between church and
state more broadly, but especially the danger of applying church structures to state structures directly, rather than maintaining a tension in the analogy, collapsing it from one into the other.
Yeah, so it just doesn't apply. I mean, it doesn't apply to natural communities, to Hildebrand. Right? So you can't look to the church and what the church as the Corpus Christi Mysticum, the mystical body of Christ, is, what animates its community, the presence of the Holy Spirit, etc. What in Hildebrand's mind could take the place of that if you don't think about common goods and common loves of those common goods? So whereas I could see a different kind of ecclesiology that Hildebrand hints at when he talks about the salvation as a common end of all the members of the church, etc. If he were thinking again, but he doesn't do that with respect to the natural communities, it seems to me. There he thinks practical, like he thinks in terms of ends and what communities aim at. But he doesn't do it. So even on that level of principle, that is what the church is for, he doesn't enter into that analogy. As the church is for salvation, so the political community is for the common happiness of its members, or something like that. He doesn't do that. Am I getting at your question?
Yeah, we can talk later.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you all so much for your questions, and thank you for coming. Help me thank our guest speaker one more time.
We'll be taking Dr. Kitzinger to an early and leisurely lunch if anyone would like to join us.
Thank you.